I'd like to welcome you to the assembly this morning. We're happy to be here and happy to have our opportunity this morning of worship. And happy to have those of you who are visiting with us this morning. We're thankful for your presence here with us. And we're just glad to be together on this, the Lord's Day, and to have this opportunity. I want to this morning study together with you a topic that's going to come primarily from the Gospel of John. I want to talk about the idea of the stories that we tell ourselves. And as we begin thinking about this particular concept, I would like to read with you some passages from John chapter 3. And these are going to be where we'll spend the majority of our time this morning. I'd like to look at John chapter 3. I want to read with you verses 22 through 36. John chapter 3, beginning of verse 22, we find the final words of John the Immerser here in the Gospel of John. And here's what occurs, beginning of verse 22. After these things, Jesus and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and there he remained with them and baptized. Now John also was baptizing in Aenon near Salem, because there was much water there. And they came and were baptized, for John had not yet been thrown into prison. Then there arose a dispute between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purification. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you testified, behold, he's baptizing, and all are coming to him. John answered and said, a man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from God. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, he who is the bride is the bride, he who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is earthly and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all. And what he has seen and heard, that he testifies. And no one receives his testimony. He who has received his testimony has certified that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for God does not give the Spirit by measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. This is John 3, verses 22 through 36. Within these particular passages, we find an exchange that we want to focus on this morning. You know, we love stories. We love stories. From the time we are little, we start learning these stories. And with Rhea, you know, we're reading these little stories. And we have this new book this week about a little bee. And this little bee, you know, flies around. And it's a good book for the springtime. And he sees flowers. And you read this little section and pull down this little flap, you know, and it shows you this character. And so who's hiding behind the cabbage, eating the carrots? Well, it's not Daddy, I'll tell you that. And so there's this rabbit, you know. So you start learning these stories from the time you're little. We just love that. And all the way through life, we love stories. In our adolescence, though, we begin kind of taking that to a different level. Maybe it varies depending on person and all of that, but we begin telling our own story. And you take your emotions, you take your perceptions, you take your memory, and you mix those together, and you begin telling the story of who you are, of what your life has been, why things are the way they are, how things should be, and so forth. And we start telling our own story. And we have this narrative kind of written in our own mind, and we know it. And when things happen, We kind of interpret things based on, that narrative a lot of the times. And that's how we respond to events around us. It's built largely around this story that we've told ourselves. So that story is kind of our identity, isn't it? It's our identity. Well, the Gospel of John is a unique gospel in many ways. One of them is that it kind of gives us a chance to see it's really hard to tell your story well. It's actually very hard to do. And when we read the Gospel of John, we're not surprised to see Jesus does it very well. Jesus understands who he is. He can tell his story perfectly. And so through John, you see Jesus say, I am the manna from heaven. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus knows. But many of the other characters in the Gospel of John, they struggle. They struggle. And as they weave these narratives together and they kind of figure out their identity, what they ultimately do is make it hard for them to have a relationship with God through Jesus. And so you have, for instance, Nicodemus in John chapter 3. And Nicodemus has this story about who he is. And who is Nicodemus? Well, he is a master teacher. He's a powerful man. He's a leader. He's somebody. And then when he talks to Jesus, he can't even really understand the importance of the plan of salvation. Among the most basic things you've got to understand to serve God in this New Testament is the plan of salvation. And Nicodemus can't see it. Because the story he tells himself, his identity. The Samaritan woman at the well, same thing. Who is she? Well, she is kind of an outcast. And she has all these regrets and these embarrassments. And who am I? Well, I am all these horrible decisions that I have made. That's who I am. So when Jesus begins kind of talking to her, she has a hard time comprehending what he's talking about. This concept of thirst and him providing for my spiritual thirst. Or the lame man at the well in John 5. The man born blind in John 9. Everybody has kind of built these stories together. Most of the time, these stories make it hard for them to see Jesus. It's hard to do it well. It's very hard to do it well. And here we sit this morning, and you've got in your mind a story about who you are and how that came to be. And whether things have worked well or they haven't, and who's responsible for that, and so on and so forth. We all have a story in our mind about who we are. Have we done a good job? And the story we tell ourselves about kind of who we are and all of that, does it make it easier for us to have a relationship with God or harder for us to have a relationship with God? How can I make sure I'm doing it right? That's the goal of our study this morning. What I want to show you is John the Immerser, he does it right. He does it right. I want to show you why. And I don't know that everything we need to know about how to do this well we learn from John 3, but some of the most important things we need to know we can learn from right here in John chapter 3. So when you come back to John chapter 3 with me to verse 22, we see the timing here of it. This, of course, is we've advanced a little bit. We're not in the very beginning of John's ministry. We're getting on a ways into his ministry. His ministry is not very long, by the way. Jesus' ministry, is over about 3.5 years. John's ministry is much shorter than that. Half that, if it's even that long. His ministry is actually very short. And in John 3 and verse 22, here comes Jesus and his disciples, and everybody's baptizing. We learn in John 4 and verse 2, by the way, that it wasn't Jesus himself doing the baptizing, it's his disciples doing it. Anyway, they're all doing this baptism, and the baptism's all the same. Except for Jesus' popularity, it's growing. It's growing. And here's these guys who have come to follow John. They've left things. They've gone out to the middle of nowhere with John. They're not living a luxurious life. They have sacrificed. And as he stands there and he confronts these Jewish leaders, they're with him. And because of that, they themselves even become targets of their criticism. These guys have walked the walk. They're not just talking the talk, they've walked the walk. They've done a good thing. And what's happening? Here come these Jewish leaders and they confront John's disciples about purification. What does that mean? That could mean a lot of different things. Maybe they're arguing with them about the baptism. It could mean so many different things. But it's an argument. It's an attack. And all of a sudden the disciples of John think, why is this happening? We're being attacked by the Jewish leaders. Jesus' ministry is growing and John's ministry is diminishing. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It's not supposed to be like this. And so they come to John and they say, John, aren't you upset with us? Aren't you upset just like we are? And John says, as a matter of fact, I'm not. There's maybe not a better setting to kind of help us see our own personal story than watching other people succeed. Boy, that can really help us see our own heart. And these disciples got to see their heart when they saw Jesus succeed. And thank God we get to see the heart of John the Immerser, because it's wonderful. When Jesus succeeds, here comes John's story. It just kind of comes out. And it's great. He's not upset by it. And so when you think of these disciples, what do you see? You see this anxiety. You see jealousy. You see kind of grievance. You see maybe even like doubt. You know what those all feel like mixed together? It's terrible, isn't it? Then you look at John and you see joy and confidence and clarity and optimism. Well, I want that. I want that. So how does he do that? What is the story of his life that helps him do that? I want you to notice three things in his story here at the end of John 3 that basically help John see himself, see his purpose in life. All of it is seen through this particular lens. Let's begin in verse 27. The very first thing John says, aren't you upset, John? We're being attacked. Our ministry is diminishing. Aren't you upset? No, I'm not. He says in verse 27, a man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven. When I really began to dig into these verses, this, as his immediate initial response, is shocking. It shouldn't be, but it was shocking to me. How could this be the very first thing he says? But it is. The very first thing that comes out when he starts thinking about this is a statement about the nature of God. That God is sovereign. He is in charge. So much of the time, our challenges, our problems in life are because we really don't understand God as much as we should, and as well as we should. And we really don't think about God as much as we should. The very first thing he says is about the nature of God. And what is it about the nature of God? He says that God, whatever man has, he has received it from God. Can receive nothing unless it's from God. In other words, John says, I'm not in charge of whether people succeed or don't succeed, or receive a blessing or don't receive a blessing. That's not up to me. The jealous heart, it is up to me. You shouldn't be having that. And I'm going to start taking some steps to make sure that's taken away from you. I'm going to tell people bad things about you. I'm going to help people see negative things about you. I'm going to get people to feel sorry for me. Those are the kinds of things maybe in the hearts of the disciples, not John. John says, God's in charge. This is a doctrine taught throughout the Bible. God is in charge. And God gets to decide. It is His responsibility to decide how to bless everyone. In Daniel chapter 4, 3 times it basically says God gives to whom He chooses. It's one of the main lessons of Daniel chapter 4. God gives to whom He chooses. It's up to Him. He blesses people however He decides. Why? I don't know. You don't know. We don't know. But it's up to God. He is sovereign. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says in verse 7, what do you have that you did not receive? Nothing. All of us are who we are because of what we've received from God. We have what we have because of what we've received from Him. James 1:17 says that every good and perfect gift comes from above. This statement that John makes is the same as all of those verses. His view of God is the starting point of how he tells his own story. What he believes about God. And an accurate, true belief about God in the Bible that John has and that others have as well. What does it have? You recognize 3 main things about God. You recognize, first of all, His unlimited power. That statement is right here in verse 27. Everything everybody has is from Him. He has unlimited power. Second, though, He is wise. He has the unlimited ability to use that power to accomplish His will. There's not a force on earth that can thwart the will of God. None. He is powerful, and He knows how to use His power. And then here's the third thing. He is good. This almighty God that we serve, that has this ability to use His power however He wants, uses it in a way that is good. Always. Not most of the time, all of the time. 100% of the time. That is God. That is His nature. We would be healthier in so many ways. We'd be healthier spiritually. We would be healthier emotionally. We would be healthier in our relationships. All of us would if we spent more time meditating on the nature of God. We spend a lot of time focused on ourselves. We would do much better if we spent more of that time focusing on God and trying to comprehend Him, stretching ourselves to try to think about this all-powerful Creator who can do everything He wants and who always does good. That just makes the world look different when we accurately see God. The second thing that John sees then is not just God's sovereignty over everybody and all of that, and God and His nature over everybody. He sees ultimately His own role. And He has embraced His role. Look at verses 28 and 29 again. John says, "You yourselves bear me witness. I said, I'm not the Christ, but I've been sent before Him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears Him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is fulfilled." John knows his role. In fact, he has been very consistently explaining his role to his followers all the way through. These statements in verse 28 here are taken from an earlier exchange John had in John chapter 1, where he was questioned about his identity. Are you the Christ? I am not the Christ. He has been consistently teaching, I am not the Messiah. That there is one greater than me who is coming after me. To be able to help them understand John's role, he uses this image in verse 29 of a bride and a bridegroom and the friend of the bridegroom. And as you ultimately see all of this together, this is a familiar image. It's used throughout the Bible lots of different times. Jesus uses it. He describes himself, Jesus does, as the bridegroom on multiple occasions in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He tells the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew 22. There's teaching about all that in the book of Revelation as well. This imagery is throughout the Bible. It's found a lot. What we learn here is John's role. He's the friend of the bridegroom. It's the cultural equivalent of the best man. That's his job. And as the best man, what's his job? The friend of the bridegroom, he's chosen by the father of the groom. And he is fully informed as to the dowry the young man's willing to pay for his bride. So this friend of the bridegroom, the dad chooses him, and he knows kind of the details of how this deal, if you want to call it that, comes together. He knows the details. And what's his job? His job is to act as an intermediary between the couple. He waits upon the bride and the bridegroom. And it is his job, the duty of the friend of the bridegroom, to present him to his bride. And after marriage, to maintain proper terms between the parties. And especially to defend the bride's good fame. And it is also absolutely forbidden that the friend of the bridegroom would ever marry the bride. By accepting this role, you agree no matter what happens, that will never be your wife. That's John's role. He's chosen by the Father. He's informed of the price that the bridegroom's going to pay. He makes the preparations necessary to present the faithful of God to the Messiah by his preaching of repentance. And further, as the friend of the bridegroom, to try to prevent the people from following the Messiah would be like the friend of the bridegroom stealing the bride for himself. John, are you upset by what's happening here? No, I'm not, because I know about God and I know my role. I'm the friend of the bridegroom. And the friend of the bridegroom has all of these responsibilities and these prohibitions, and I'm aware of them, and I'm good with that. You see, what John recognizes is not just some abstract view of God and his sovereignty and how he's sovereign over everybody. He recognizes that he's sovereign over me. And that he's the giver of good things to me. And my story and your story, we have a role to play. And part of why we get to play that role is because of the goodness of God in our lives. And it's not the role somebody else plays, but it's the role I get to play. And so we think about that this morning. You think about that if you are married. If you're married this morning, you have that privilege, you have that ability to enjoy that relationship because of the goodness of God in your life. There's no mystery about it. Proverbs said that a wife is from the Lord. So thank God for that. And if you're married today, whatever your responsibilities are within your marriage, God has given you the opportunity of that marriage. And the challenges you face, well, you get to face them together. And the difficulties that life brings, you get to face them together. And Maybe you have these. Maybe you have little disagreements, little challenges you work through in your own little dynamic. Well, thank God that you have someone to work on yourself with like that. And that you can serve someone else's interest by helping them grow. And in our marriages, what is the whole point? We're supposed to serve one another, aren't we? We ought to make each other better. And we should be a blessing to the person we're married to. And you're not married to everybody else. You're married to your spouse. Well, thank God for that. Thank God for your marriage. Thank God for the privilege you have every day to be in your marriage. Maybe you have responsibilities in your work. You have roles in your work, and you don't have the same job everybody else does, but you have your job. And you have your responsibilities. And I'm guessing sometimes in your job you have long, difficult days. Maybe you have long, difficult months. Maybe you have long, difficult years. But thank God for your job. Thank God for the skills that you have to perform your job. Thank God for the opportunities to interact with the people that you're able to be around in your job. Even the difficult people that through you get a chance to see the light of Christ in this world. We have our roles. You have yours, I have mine. We have them in our private family lives. We have them in our work lives. We have them in the church. We have them in our community. The roles that we get to play, what we see there is we see this all-powerful God who is wise, sharing good things with us. Not always easy things, but good things. And we can be thankful for the role that we get to play. And we can praise God for the ability that we have the opportunity to play that role. Whatever it is, whatever role you might think about. And I could just go on and on with this list of the different roles we get to play in life. Remembering that these roles are the gift of God. They are because of the goodness of God that we have these opportunities and these relationships. So John greets this success, this challenge, the angst that all of these disciples feel with comfort and calm and confidence and clarity because he knows about God's nature and he has embraced the role that God in his wise goodness and his powerful nature has given John to play. But now the third thing is that John understands the importance of Jesus. This is a beautiful statement in verse 30. He must increase, I must decrease. That word must, that's describing a moral imperative. Like there's no way around it. Just exactly like you could not stop the sun from coming up tomorrow morning. There's not a thing I could do to make that not happen. And not only that, there's nothing I could do to make the darkness stay while the sun comes up. The darkness is going to get chased away when the sun comes up tomorrow morning. That's this kind of imperative, like it's just a law and you can't break it. This is the law. This is how things need to be. He must increase. I must decrease. That is John's life. For him, it was an absolute rule. This is the way it has to be. He has to grow, and I have to diminish. And as you think about that for a moment, you might see an opportunity maybe for John to feel sort of underappreciated, frustrated, disappointed, maybe feeling like he was cheated somehow because of this role where somebody else got to be bigger than him. But that's not how John sees it. Because this isn't just anybody, this is Jesus. He must increase, I must decrease. Why did John see Jesus that way? And why was it that as he thought about his life, Jesus increasing is kind of the central component of all of this? This is really what it's about. Because he understands what Jesus means. Notice here as we look through the end of John chapter 3, the explanation that's then provided. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is earthly and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all. So that's talking about Jesus, isn't it? Why is he going to increase and I'm going to decrease? Because he's not earthly, he's heavenly. He is different than me. And John knows I can't see what he can see. I don't understand what he understands. I don't have the perception that he has because of where I'm from. I'm earthly. Jesus isn't. Jesus is above all. Verse 32 says, "And what he has seen and heard, that he testifies. And no one receives his testimony. He who receives his testimony is certified that God is true." And so Jesus brings, not hearsay. Jesus brings eyewitness testimony. He tells people about things he knows from his own personal experience. And when he talks about heaven or whatever, it's not because he's heard about it. He's there. He knows what it's like. And so Jesus is testifying. He's giving this information. Who else can do that? Who else has ever been on earth that could do that? Like Jesus, no one. And yet it says at the very end that most people rejected him. No one receives his testimony. But in verse 33, he who does has certified that God is true. And so by receiving Jesus, you kind of place your own personal stamp of approval on the truth of God. You line yourself up with God who is true, with Jesus who is true. You take your stand right there with them. Now, who else on earth can do any of that, can provide that kind of insight? No one but Jesus. Why is he that way? In verse 34, he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for God does not give the Spirit by measure. And so every single thing Jesus said was in harmony with heaven, because everything he said is fully inspired by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is present with Jesus through his entire ministry. There's complete agreement between heaven and Jesus and every single thing that happened, every single thing he said. Verse 35, the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. And he who believes in the Son has everlasting life. He who does not believe the Son shall not see life. The wrath of God abides on him. So God has already shown his view of Jesus. He loves him. He's exalted him. Now it's up to the rest of us. Verse 36 says, if you believe him, look what's in front of you. And if you don't, one of the scariest verses in the New Testament is John 3 and 36. If you don't believe in Jesus, the wrath of God abides on you. The wrath of God. That's a frightening verse. And so it just shows, why is Jesus so central? Because every single thing for every single person in eternity is decided based on what they do with Jesus. So John's life was all about promoting Jesus because he understood how important Jesus was to every single person he would ever meet. He understood the stakes. The stakes are eternal. Okay, so John, he does a good job. Here comes success in the life of somebody else, and what spills out of the heart of John? All this beautiful stuff. Beautiful. Why does he do such a good job telling his story? Because John has an accurate view of our all-powerful and wise God, who in his goodness performs all of his work. And John sees in his own individual life that the goodness of God has blessed him with the opportunities that he has. And that he is thankful for the role that God has given him to play in this life. And that his ultimate purpose in life, it's not about John. It's about Jesus. He must increase, I must decrease. How the world would be better if that was the mantra of every husband and every wife, of every parent, of every church leader, of every gospel preacher, of every Christian. If we realized it isn't about us, it's not about me. Whatever people think of me, that's not going to help them go to heaven. What they think about Jesus, that will determine whether or not they go to heaven. It's about him. If you want to do a good job telling your story, be like John. Develop an accurate view of God. Work on your view of God. Work on your understanding of his nature. And then be able to make that connection between his powerful, wise, and good nature and your own individual role in life. And then may we all maintain the priority of promoting Jesus and of making our life about promoting Jesus Christ. In this way, we can be able to have more accurate stories. And instead of telling stories of grievance and anxiety and jealousy like the disciples did, we can tell stories about salvation like John does at the end of John 3. We've come to the